So I'm Sonia, and I am the Associate Director for Dataverse Support and Data Curation with the Harvard Dataverse Repository. And Katie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Mika. I'm a data librarian in Harvard Library.
All right, and today we're going to be talking about the Harvard Dataverse Repository, FAIR, and the NIH DMP Harvard Dataverse Guidance document that we created as part of our initiative with the National Institute of Health, the Generalist Repository Initiative, Ecosystem Initiative, with 6 other generalist repositories working to improve data sharing in the biomedical sciences. All right. Here are the topics we'll cover today. Because this is only a 60-minute webinar, it's not a training. We do hope to offer some full-length trainings soon. We're going to touch on a lot of the topics listed here. We've picked out some features to discuss or give a little bit of more information on, and then you'll be able to ask some questions, and we'll be able to point you to some references and some documentation that we have available for the features we're going to talk about today. All right, so first we're going to have an overview of Dataverse really quickly. So most people know that, and hopefully you do as well, that Dataverse project is an open source software platform designed to help researchers and institutions share, preserve, and cite and explore and analyze research data. Metadata being a really essential component of the project, and it helps provide content and facilitate discovery and reuse of data. Currently, there are 126 Dataverse supported repositories around the world, with Harvard Dataverse Repository being the first instance of the repository that was released, and it is one of about 2 that's open for use by researchers around the world. So the software supports over 50 features and tools that will help you to share your data to meet FAIR standards. This list of features right here, it was last updated around 2022. We're actually working on adding all the new features since then. But there is a link to the features and a link to our website that you can use to look at all of the new features that are available. So we have features that promote research data transparency and reproducibility, features that provide easy data deposit by supporting multiple data formats. We have features that provide there's standardizing data citations and DOIs that allow researchers to cite and track the use of their data. We have data access control options like restrictions, embargoes, and controlled workflows. And of course, we spoke a little bit about the metadata standards already, including Dublin Core, DataCite, and the Dataverse metadata schema to ensure consistency and standardization. We do have data sharing policies for the Harvard Dataverse Repository, and that's there to guide users in sharing data because that is what we do. A number of repositories support only articles and data. We support data, and you are welcome to put in supplementary documentation and articles as long as you have reusable data with your deposit. And of course, the features help to make data discoverable, making it easier to find and reuse existing data. So Katie's going to just talk a little bit about FAIR, and then we'll go on from there to some of the features.
Sure. Thanks, Sonia. So what would a data sharing webinar be without a slide on the FAIR data principles? So if you're not familiar with these, they're widely used across most data repositories. FAIR is an acronym stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. This concept was first published in Scientific Data in 2016, and these are a set of guiding principles that were proposed by a consortium of scientists and organizations to support the reusability of digital assets. So importantly, the principles don't just apply to kind of data in the conventional sense, but also to the algorithms and the tools and the workflows that led to the production of that data. All scholarly digital research objects, so from data to software to analytical pipelines, anything like that can really benefit from the application of these principles. Since all components of the research process are increasingly, we're thinking about them becoming or making them available to ensure transparency, reproducibility, and reusability. The principles emphasize machine actionability. So the capacity of a computational system to find, access, interoperate, and reuse these data with either none or with minimal human intervention. Because humans are increasingly relying on computational support to deal with data as a result of the increase in volume, complexity, creation, and speed of data creation. Dataverse gives you the tools to move your data towards each principle, making data findable and discoverable with metadata and persistent identifiers, connections to other searchable resources. It creates accessibility that is open and free, yet also allows for authorization and authentication or other types of mediation when required. Interoperability for analysis, for storage, and for processing. And the data are reusable because they can be well described for use in multiple different ways. The Dataverse software and infrastructure supports the data, the metadata, and the tools needed to support these principles. All right, next slide. Thank you. And so I like to think about talking about FAIR as a balance between the researchers and the repository's responsibilities to accomplish all of this and ensure the long-term preservation, stewardship, and utility of research data. Dataverse provides the infrastructure, and individual repositories offer services that make it possible to share FAIR data, but researchers are the ones that know their data really well and are often the best to organize, to structure, and to describe their data for other users. All right, next slide.
All right. I'm going to do these next couple of slides, which is getting started with the Dataverse repository and mainly the Harvard Dataverse Repository. Okay. So even if it's not required, consider creating a data management plan to help you organize your data for sharing. There are several steps to ensure the deposited data is of high quality, properly documented and organized, and is accessible and usable by others. One of the things about the Harvard Dataverse Repository is that we do go back. We have a post-publishing management workflow here. So once content is published, we go in and review it to ensure that it meets our policy one, that there's no copyright violations. That typically comes to us from the people who own the data if someone has violated copyright. No sensitive data because the repository does not support sensitive data. Data needs to be anonymized beforehand. And we also ensure that there are data in the deposits that are being created. So again, we emphasize, not depositing just supplementary documentation that doesn't include reusable data. You can add any documentation, any related articles, as long as you include the data files that can be reused for research. So things to consider are data formatting. Ensure your data formatted correctly and consistent with standards for specific data files in your fields. There are files that get additional functionality in Harvard Dataverse, and those are tabular files. So we have features that offer this additional support for SPSS data, CSV file, Excel file, R file, but you should just make sure that your data are formatted correctly. Perform quality control checks to ensure that your data is complete, accurate, free of errors. Check for missing values, outliers, and inconsistencies. And mostly because when someone is going to use your data or reuse your data in the Harvard Dataverse or in any repository, they're likely going to reach out to you with questions they have about your data and any inconsistencies they see about your data. They're not going to reach out to us because we're a hosting platform. Create metadata for the data sets, including information such as some that are required, title, author, description, keywords, related publications. This is gonna help others to find and understand the data set that you're sharing. We have version control, but you should always have version control as well for your deposits because you're allowed to come back in and edit your data set as often as you need. So you want to create multiple versions of the data set to track changes over time when you are managing your own data. Document the data by providing data dictionaries, code books, or other supporting material that explain the variables and methods used in the data set. And determine your access controls. Who can access the data set and under what conditions? The Harvard Dataverse Repository is set to CC0 by default. So that's one thing to pay attention to when you're depositing your data, is that by default, you need to go into the terms page and decide if that license works for your data or not. But with access control, this could include restricting access to a particular group or requiring users to agree to custom terms and conditions before accessing the data. Numerous times, an entire data set with numerous files, there are some files that are restricted to a particular group and then other files that are open for access. So think about creative ways to manage your content in terms of access control. And then, of course, always, in using a repository, what you're doing is you're ensuring that the data are preserved for the long term. You're storing them in a secure and reliable repository like the Harvard Dataverse. You're using appropriate file formats, and we provide good storage practices, but you also need to do that on your end. Okay. So the Harvard Dataverse Repository was released in 2006 for use by the worldwide research community. And the intention is to really provide a self-curated and managed space for ease of data sharing. All deposits are reviewed daily to ensure they meet our data sharing requirements and that they do not violate our repository policies. And just remember that we do have a support group team in place that you can email with any questions before you get started with your data deposit, especially if you have a large project that you'd like to deposit and share that's grant funded, and you want to ensure that you are doing that correctly. Okay, so we're going to talk about the basic guidelines for data sharing on the repository, which is really going to be creating an account, creating a new collection and adding your data sets and uploading your files and publishing your data set. Again, this is not unfortunately, this is not a 3-hour training, which we will offer at some point. So we're going to touch on the basics. But what I've done is I've included a number of slides that I'm going to skip in this presentation, but that you can reference, that has the details on a lot of our features that come at the collection level, the data set level, and the file level. So to get started on the Dataverse repository, when you're adding content, you have to create an account. In creating this account, you are agreeing to our terms for using the system, and anyone who accesses data on our system is also agreeing to our terms on how to use the data. Our policy page will be available for everyone to look at and see what practices to follow. But there are several ways to create an account and share your data or access restricted content on the Harvard Dataverse repository. We recommend, when possible, to log in with a proper authentication over using a generic email account. So to use Shibboleth, if you're from another organization, your organization institution should register with incommon.org. InCommon provides integrated service and software solutions to address single sign-on access to cloud and local services and seamless global collaborations for students, faculty, staff, researchers. So as you can see, what's showing up on this login page is Harvard University, because this is a screenshot that I get every time I go into the Harvard system. I'm already set for Harvard, so I use that. There's a drop down of all of the institutions. If you use that drop down arrow that you see there, of all the institutions that are actually registered with InCommon. But if you try to log in and you are not able to log in with your institution, if it's on this list, that means that your institution needs to actually activate the link between this authentication system in order for you to log into the Harvard Dataverse repository using that system, okay? But there are a number of other ways to log in: user mail, GitHub, Google, ORCID. But that is the first step to actually creating content and being able to manage your content at another time. So we highly recommend that when you use the Harvard Dataverse repository, you create your own project space called collections, a collection. Collections can also have sub-collections, and I am giving you here screenshots of an overview of a collection that currently exists on the Harvard Dataverse. Collections are customized with metadata, searchable facets, and logos to support your research data. The difference between coming in and putting one data set in the Harvard Dataverse Repository is that the Harvard Dataverse Repository root space is customized with limited metadata, just citation metadata is all we require. So when you have your own collection space, you're able to use all of the other metadata that you see in the screenshots, like journal metadata, social science and humanities metadata, astronomy metadata, life sciences. So you get more options to customize and use additional metadata and searchable facets to describe your collection and make it more useful. So as you can see from the screenshot here, this is the Brain Genomics Superstruct project. They've been able to customize their collection with their logo, a link back to their project site. And there's also a contact option there, and that contact goes to the owners of that collection for the Brain Genomics Superstruct project, so that if you have a question, you can contact them, and you'll, directly communicate with the authors instead of communicating with the support team, which will normally bring you back to the authors at some point. So your project team can be collection administrators, curators, or contributors. Collections allow administrators to control who can contribute and publish content. Journals typically use a submit for review workflow with their collections. And we are going to have a webinar on permission features coming up later this semester, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the permission features here. But when you use a submit for review workflow, it allows the journal to review content or contributed content, request modifications to contributed content, or make any additional edits, and basically approve the content for publication. So those are things that you get with a collection. You don't get that by just dropping one single data set in the root repository. Other projects utilize collections for the added value of the customization we spoke about, a space where all data sets can be deposited, including sub-collections, and the ability to use that additional metadata standards beyond the default setting of the repository. Okay. So data sets are deposited within your personal or project collection space, or simply deposited into the root repository if you don't have multiple data sets to share. They are supported by files, metadata, terms and licenses, and versioning. All data sets get a standard citation and a DOI. There are over 100 metadata fields to choose from to help describe your research project. The Harvard Dataverse Repository in general, whether you have a collection or not, every data set requires 5 metadata fields to help build your citation and describe your data set. That would be the project title, the author, the contact, the subject, and the project description. And authors can add their affiliated identifier schemas to the dataset metadata author field. We have a number of forthcoming new features related to the dataset page, including support for research organization, registry, or WAR. So all data sets, you're going to be deposited in the root. If you have one data set, if you have more than one data set, we highly recommend that you create a collection to support all of your data sets. Data sets also come with a couple of features that you can utilize. So when you first deposit a data set into a repository, it's in draft format. So we have a private URL feature that allows authors to share their content prior to publishing. There is a guestbook feature that you can use once you publish, and that guestbook feature has to be used with a collection. So you have to have a collection with your data sets within it. But the guestbook feature allows you to collect information on how your data are being used by others without interrupting the access workflow. And we also have multiple license support, and anonymous peer review is forthcoming within the next month or so. So these are all data set level features. Some of them have to be created at the collection level. So if you don't have a collection, you can't utilize a guest book. But if you can see, you get metrics for your data set. You have edit options for your files, your metadata, your terms, permissions. You can give permissions by data set level or at the file level. You get preview URLs, thumbnails, and we have a Turbo Curator by ICPSR, which is a curation tool that will help you develop a description or additional metadata for your study by answering a few questions. It is AI-based. And once you publish a data set on the Harvard Dataverse Repository, the only option you have is to deaccession the data set. You cannot delete content. It is a publishing platform. We have various workflows for deleting content that's managed by the repository administrators. You have to have a very good reason to delete a data set that has been published. And if a data set has been published and accessed by others, you can't delete it. You have to deaccession it. And all that does is leave a tombstone page with that citation and that DOI so that someone can know that the data were there, and then you get to put in a reason why you're deaccessioning the data set. But as you can see, you get your full citation there. I shared a screenshot of the Brain Genomics Superstruct project citation with that DOI. Every time you edit your data set, you create a new version. You don't get a new DOI. This is why you don't want to get into the habit of deaccessioning and deleting. You want to edit your data set, make it better, and then publish a new version of it so that you retain your DOI. Each data set comes with a file page, a metadata page, a terms page, and a versions page. And the versioning is done on the back end automatically by the software. Okay. Now, the Harvard Dataverse requires data files to be deposited with all data sets. All file types are supported with additional metadata extraction and data analysis and visualization support for tabular data files that we talked about before, SPSS files, Stata files, R files, Excel files. I've included some images of the features currently available in Harvard Dataverse, including the file level access restrictions via embargo and restriction features, data analysis and visualization options using the Data Explorer version 2, which is created by our colleagues at Borealis that have an extensive Dataverse installation that supports 72 organizations. And then permission and access control exists at all levels that we've talked about so far. At the collection level, you get to decide who helps you to add content to your collection. At the data set level, you also get to manage who can publish, who can't publish, who can deposit data sets. At the file level, you get to manage whether somebody can access an entire data set, or if you're going to have files that require that they request access to a particular file, and then you'll be able to grant the access on the other side. So I've mentioned metadata, restrict, unrestrict, tags or for additional metadata functionality. You can embargo files and you can delete files as you're doing editing and reversioning of your data. Okay, we are not going to talk a lot about permissions. I actually have a number of files that I'm going to skip, a number of slides that I'm skipping. But I want you to know that they're here because what we've done is give you just some really good examples of the functionality. We have AI tools, and we have the request access functionality for restricted content. And I'm going to skip over some of these really quickly so that we can get on to the next part of our talk so we have time for questions. But here is the AI tool that's available for tabular data sets. So again, those files that are in SPSS, Stata, R, Excel, once converted, if it's ingested, if this feature works on your file, it doesn't have to, and your file is still fine. But if it does, you have this Ask the Data AI feature that we've added that you can actually ask a question of the data set, and it will give you an answer. It comes with a preview tool of the file, but you can ask the question in several languages as well. And that's one of our newest features that we're testing. So I'm going to skip through this. Actually, you'll be able to see it in the slides. But right now, I wanted to introduce a couple of new features. Forthcoming, this is already in our demo website, and you can test it in the demo website, is support for traditional knowledge labels via collaborations with local contexts. So the traditional knowledge labels are an initiative for indigenous communities and local organizations. The labels allow communities to express local and specific conditions for sharing and engaging in future research and relationships in ways that are consistent with already existing community rules, governance, and protocols for using, sharing, and circulating knowledge and data. The TK labels support the inclusion of local protocols for access and use to cultural heritage that is digitally circulating outside community context. So the labels identify and clarify community-specific rules and responsibilities regarding access and future use of traditional knowledge. This includes sacred and or ceremonial material that has gender restrictions, seasonal conditions of use, and even material specifically designed for outreach purposes. So again, this is in the demo website. We've asked the community for feedback, and it will be implemented really shortly into the Harvard Dataverse instance, and then be available for other communities that we have in Canada, in Australia, and in Brazil to use to support Indigenous data. We have a new service. We're now supporting large data projects in the Harvard Dataverse. That means you have terabytes over, your files are pretty large, or you have thousands or millions of files. There's an intake form, and I have a link to our support website. There's an intake form there that you use to request this service. We have a budget planner we use to give you a cost. It is really low cost. And we have instructions for both the download and depositing data. Once you have your collection, you will have to have a collection in order to manage large data. And the large data are possible through infrastructures and global integration. So we're using NESI, global integrations with Globus. And this is how we can provide this service, given the relationship that Harvard University has with these large data support infrastructures. So note that this is a moderated effort that is only provided via paid services. You have to come through our services in order to utilize the integration with Globus. We have to set that up for your collection on the back end before you can utilize the service, but it is available. And of course, we do have our paid curation services that I've also included here that you can find on the support website. All right, we're going to go to talk about Gray. Katie, do you want to take over from here? You don't have to do the introductory slides, but you can go right directly into your talk.
You don't want me to do Gray?
Oh, it's only a couple of slides. I can do the introduction.
Yeah, why don't you do the Gray overview and I'll do the
Okay.
NIH stuff.
All right, so we are talking about the National Institute of Health and the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative project that has been going on for we're going into year 4 in March. It is a 4-year grant. So it's a long-term vision for 7 generalist repositories to develop collaborative approaches for data management and sharing through the inclusion of the Generalist Repository in the NIH data ecosystem. Gray aims to better enable search and discovery of NIH-funded data in the Generalist repositories. Repositories involved in Gray are working on a co-opetition plan to support metadata and tools that enhance the fairness of data. The mission is twofold. The primary mission is to establish a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, metrics, and social infrastructures across various repositories. And the repositories are all listed there. It's Dataverse, mainly the Harvard Dataverse, Dryad, Figshare, Open Science Framework, and Vivly that already collaborate with Harvard for a data sharing space, Zenodo and Mendeley Data. And secondarily, Gray will raise awareness and help researchers to adopt FAIR principles to better share and reuse data. So a number of our content around Gray is deposited in Zenodo in the Gray space. So you can find all of our publications. We have blogs, we have information on metadata, best practices. We are going to be presenting best practices for large data support, additional metadata capabilities that we're going to enable in all of the repositories in terms of what we support. ROAR being one of those things that is a collaboration in this Gray project. Sensitive data support. We're working on figuring out how all of the repositories support or plan to support, or if they will support sensitive data, and how they do a quality assessment and management and data curation, so that we can come up with best practices for all of these repositories to support the research community in their needs for fair data sharing. So for Harvard Dataverse in particular, we've developed the integration with Globus for large data support that is in place, but there is a demo that you can always look at in order to find out how this works. Remote data support for trusted remote storage options, so that if somebody has a collection that's already in a trusted repository or trusted location, not so much another repository, then we will bring in all of the metadata and point to this trusted remote storage option. And also incorporating flexible biomedical metadata support, which is in progress now. We're planning to support UMLS, MESH, and CDAR, and a number of other things, including hierarchical vocabulary. At the file level support, additional metadata for code files, replication packages, sensitive data support, not there yet, so don't drop any sensitive data. It would be a violation of the policy, and it would also require that we remove your content. And of course, we're improving usage metrics, some new enhancements, the curation services, new APIs and interoperability. So you can see some of the features that we're supporting. Now we're going to talk about the NIH data management and sharing policy and what they're going to be requiring of people who are funded by the project. And Katie's going to take that on.
Sure. Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, so we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about specifically the NIH data management and sharing policy that went into effect, I guess almost 2 years ago now. Because not just because of the work that Dataverse is doing with Gray, but also because a number of other funders, all federal funders, a number of other private funders are starting to require some degree of public access. So we're seeing a lot of public access policies coming out from federal funders. I think all of them are supposed to be implemented this year. So we see NSF has a public access policy that's been released. A number of other funders do as well. A lot of them are based off of this NIH policy. And so I wanted to quickly kind of go over a background that I think helps give some context for why we started talking about FAIR, why we talked about some of the specific features in Dataverse, and how you can kind of use this information to write a really effective data management and sharing plan for either NIH or for another funder. So yeah, okay, next slide. The NIH data management and sharing plan that this policy requires is for PIs to submit a plan that is 2 pages long and describes how they plan to manage and share their research data. The NIH is specifically looking for PIs to indicate how they plan to maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data. And the policy explicitly wants plans to make use of existing data repositories like Dataverse. The timeline, I think, is significant to call out in this policy too. They say as soon as possible, and specifically no later than the time of an associated publication or the end of an award. And specific ICOs may have more guidance that will be important to review depending on a given funding opportunity. Specific funding opportunities may, for example, already call out a specific repository that you might have to use. And the link to this NIH scientific data sharing website is a really useful resource. And I would encourage you to check it out if you are an NIH researcher, obviously. Next slide. Okay, the NIH encourages researchers to select data repositories that exemplify what we call a specific set of desired characteristics to share their research data. These repository features really align with FAIR and aim to ensure that data are managed and shared in kind of consistent ways that follow best practices. These 3 links are to resources that are created by the NIH that can be helpful when selecting a repository. The first is this list of desired characteristics, includes a little bit of additional criteria for human subjects research data. And then the next 2 links are lists of recommended repositories. And Harvard Dataverse is listed as a recommended generalist repository. So it's a great option for you to use. Okay, next slide. The kind of landscape of data repositories, I just have a few slides to kind of illustrate this a little bit, is vast, it's ever evolving, it's complex, but it can be divided into 3 main types: the domain-specific repositories, generalist repositories, and institutional repositories. They all have a specific focus. So either by like data type, so sequence data, protein structure, things like that, or by discipline. So biomedical research, like, or it could be more specific, like cancer, immunology, or clinical data, or it could be associated with a specific NIH institute or center. These domain-specific open access data sharing repositories, whether they are funded by NIH or by other sources, are usually the best kind of first choice for researchers, and NIH encourages the use of kind of domain-specific repositories. Next slide. But there's obviously a lot of instances when researchers are unable to find a domain-specific repository that's either applicable or the perfect choice for their research. In these cases, a generalist repository that accepts data regardless of data type or discipline or affiliation could be a really good fit. Biomedical researchers already share data, software code, and other digital research projects by lots of different generalist repositories, hosted by lots of different institutions, and are often recommended by journals, publishers, and funders. Sonia already talked about Gray a little bit, so we can see the list of all of these generalist repositories here. These are all great options, although I'm sure you would find everybody on this webinar would say that Harvard Dataverse is the best option for you to use if you're looking at a generalist repository. And then finally, institutional repositories. If you're a Harvard researcher, Harvard Dataverse is also your institutional data repository. But we think about them as a separate category in general because a lot of other institutions, other libraries, other universities have specific repositories that generally provide better support for their affiliates. So if someone uses something like Zenodo, that's a generalist repository, they don't have a lot of like curation support. But as a Harvard researcher, you have a lot of access to curation support, both from the library and from the Dataverse team when you're using Harvard Dataverse. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this new requirement, I guess it's not so new anymore, for the data management and sharing plan applies to all grant applications seeking NIH funds and will generate research data. So again, all applications have to submit this 2-page plan on how the data will be managed and shared throughout the project. Plans have to include where, how, and when data will be shared. The NIH is, again, encouraging the use of these established repositories. I think going through this kind of pre-award process, and the next slide will be post-award process, will kind of give you some specifics on how this process works and then how Harvard Dataverse can help kind of write a data management plan, call out some specific features that will help you through the actual process of writing and submitting a data management and sharing plan. So as part of the pre-award process, I wanted to call out that this plan is not part of the peer review process of the grant review, unless data sharing is like the kind of integral component of the project and the funding opportunity. Instead, PIs are going to work with program officers to agree on and to revise plan details, and then you can resubmit your plan as part of the just-in-time process. So don't be too, try your best at kind of your first draft, but you can expect that there's going to be some back and forth during that just-in-time process as you're submitting. Okay, next slide. All right. Then the data management plan then becomes somewhat binding as a term and condition of award. Researchers have to comply with the approved plan and communicate changes throughout the grant as part of the RPPR process, which stands for Research Performance Progress Report. And there are annual, interim, and final versions of that. The NIH has indicated that future funding may be tied to compliance with the new policy. So as you kind of work through your award, if you have been kind of discovered to not be sharing your data according to your plan, NIH has indicated that they may withhold kind of the next year of funding. So keep that in mind. All right, next slide. And then the last thing we kind of wanted to focus on here today is the Harvard Dataverse curation team has designed a helpful kind of guidance document that can be used as a resource for planning to use Harvard Dataverse when drafting a data management and sharing plan. This resource contains a lot of helpful information on how to apply and describe a variety of repository features that support good data management and sharing practices. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm gonna kind of run through each of these very quickly because we just have about, I guess, 14 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. And they're all of these slides are structured the same, and they're probably more helpful to kind of look at on the website. Yeah. But in general, they're organized according to elements that are suggested by the NIH data management and sharing plan kind of documentation. So element 1 asks you to briefly describe the scientific data to be managed, preserved, and shared. And so this asks you to summarize the kind of the types and the amounts of data that you expect to generate, which of those you are planning to preserve and to share, and to list metadata, other relevant data, and any documentation that will be made accessible. And so each element within this guidance document then gives you some idea of what Harvard Dataverse supports, and then gives you some sample text that you can use. You can either lift it directly in many cases, or you can kind of edit it to be reasonable for your piece. And the one I wanted to call out, I think Sonia is already there actually. Yeah. So a couple of the elements are more useful than others. This element 5, access, distribution, and reuse considerations, is really useful. You can expect to kind of call out Dataverse in some specific ways here. But yeah, I think that's a kind of a useful way to look at this this guidance document. All right, and then I think, yes, that slide, please. You've got it, Sonia?
The budgeting?
Yeah, if you want to go over it, or I'm happy to talk about it too.
Okay, oh, sure. So the budgeting, you know, everybody needs to budget these days for, especially supporting large data, because we've started to get more and more, especially for the biomedical fields, really large projects coming in. And I think researchers may have more faith in the generalist repositories that are out there being able to support large projects than is actually the reality. It is the reality now for the Harvard Dataverse. So allowing, you know, costs directly attributed to the project, allowable costs may be included in your NIH budget. There are some examples of budget items that may be related to sharing and managing data. So we have put together this budgeting specifically for the Harvard Dataverse. And we will, again, we have links in our support site for the large data infrastructure support that a lot of biomedical researchers may run into. And remember, it's not just terabytes of data. It's also if you have thousands and millions of files, that's also considered large data. So that's what we have to say on that. And that is it. We have a lot of guidance that we've included, a lot of links to our community and the guide and content that you may be interested in looking at. Okay, questions. We can open it up for questions. We could either unmute or use the Q&A. We do hope that folks have some questions for us. We hope it was useful. You can raise, oh, sorry. Any comments or issues regarding the anonymized view? Well, not yet, Phil. We'll get that. Yeah, we'll get that to you internally. We have to have a chance to review it, and I think we just shared that link the other day. So, let's see. There's something in QA. Is it possible to access, make updates to a prior data set entry you've created in the Harvard Dataverse later? Oh, yes, absolutely, Jared. So, you know, if you've been using your Harvard University key and PIN or any institutional key and PIN when you deposited your data, if you contact us via support with your new affiliation, we can merge the accounts so that you can continue to have access to your content. Remember, the Harvard Dataverse Repository doesn't retain copyright of your content. It's your content. We provide the infrastructure, so you will always continue to have access to your data, no matter if you have a later institutional affiliation or just your Gmail address. As long as you contact support, they'll merge all of your accounts, and you'll be able to continue to edit and add to your collection and to the Harvard repository.